Princess Valeth stood tall in the grand court of the Xelara Empire, her piercing violet eyes scanning the room with boredom. Another suitor had just failed. He was strong, tall, and bred from a noble line. But like all the others, he was not good enough. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, she turned away. "I reject him," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. The gathered nobles whispered among themselves. This was the 20th suitor she had rejected this season. Warriors, scholars, strategists, none had impressed her. Some thought she was being arrogant. Others believed she was waiting for someone truly worthy. The emperor, her father, sighed in frustration. "Valeth, you must choose. The empire needs a strong heir." She crossed her arms. "Then find someone strong enough to deserve me." Just then, the court doors swung open, and a figure stepped inside. He was not like the Xelaran warriors. He was shorter, leaner, and lacked the bioluminescent markings of her people. His hair was dark, his eyes sharp, and his expression unreadable. A whisper spread across the room. "A human." Valeth raised an eyebrow. "A human." Here, the Xelaran Empire did not see humans as equals. They were a young species, full of unpredictable behavior and reckless bravery. The human stepped forward. His name was David Carter, a former soldier turned diplomat. He had been sent by the Terran Alliance to negotiate trade agreements, but now he found himself the center of attention in a royal court that barely tolerated his existence. Valeth studied him, expecting to see fear in his eyes. There was none. Instead, there was something infuriating: confidence. The emperor leaned forward, amused. "Human, do you know where you stand?" David glanced around. "In a room full of people who think they're better than me." The court gasped. Valeth's eyes narrowed. No one had ever spoken so carelessly in her presence. "You are bold, human, but boldness does not make you worthy." David shrugged. "I don't care about being worthy to you." The nobles were shocked. Every suitor before him had begged for Valeth's favor, yet this human didn't care. Valeth felt something strange: annoyance and curiosity. "Very well, human," she said, stepping closer. "You don't care about impressing me. Then let's see if you can survive me." She smirked. "I challenge you. Prove your strength, your mind, and your endurance. If you win, I will reconsider my rejection of all males." David met her gaze without hesitation. "All right, let's play." The court erupted in chaos. No one could believe it. The Xelaran princess, who rejected all males, had just issued a challenge to a human. And worse, the human accepted. The court was silent for a moment before whispers filled the grand hall. A human competing against the Xelaran princess. It was unheard of. Valeth stood tall, her violet eyes locked onto David. No one had ever dared to speak to her the way he did. No one had ever refused to impress her. This human was different, and that annoyed her. David crossed his arms. "So, what's this challenge of yours?" The emperor leaned back on his golden throne, amused. "Princess Valeth has 3 trials for any who seek her favor: a test of intellect, a test of combat, and a test of endurance. No suitor has ever passed all 3. David smirked. "Sounds fun." Valeth's lips curled into a slight smile. "We shall see if you still think it is fun when you fail, human." The nobles laughed, convinced this human would be crushed. The first trial. A battle of minds. The first challenge took place in the Chamber of Wisdom, a grand hall filled with glowing holographic puzzles, ancient strategy games, and logic tests. The trial would test intelligence, problem-solving, and tactical thinking. David sat across from Valeth at a stone table. A floating orb projected an ancient Xelaran war game, a strategy simulation used to train generals. The objective? Outmaneuver the opponent's forces on a virtual battlefield. "You may go first, human," Valeth said, her tone mocking. David studied the board for a moment, then made a bold move, sacrificing one of his strongest units early. The nobles gasped at his foolishness. Velith smirked. "You don't know how to play, do you?" she said. David just shrugged. "We'll see." The game continued, and Velith's confidence grew as she captured more of his forces. But then, halfway through, she noticed something. David wasn't playing recklessly. His sacrificed units had trapped her army. Her smirk disappeared. In a final move, David outflanked her forces and delivered a crushing blow. The game board flashed red, indicating his victory. The court fell silent. The untouchable princess, the genius of the Celeran royal bloodline, had lost to a human. Velith stared at the board, then at David. He leaned back and gave her a casual smile. "You were saying?" Her fists clenched. No one had ever outsmarted her like this. The Emperor chuckled, amused. "Interesting. The human has passed the first trial." Velith stood up abruptly, her pride wounded. "Enjoy your small victory, human. The next trial will not be so easy." David smirked, looking forward to it. As Velith turned away, her heart pounded with frustration. But deep inside, for the first time, she felt something else. A strange, unfamiliar excitement. Velith stormed out of the Chamber of Wisdom, her pride wounded. She had never lost a battle of minds before, especially not to a human. The way David had smiled after his victory annoyed her. She would wipe that smirk off his face in the next trial. David followed, hands in his pockets, calm as ever. He enjoyed how frustrated the princess looked. She wasn't used to losing, but he knew this wasn't over yet. The court gathered in the Arena of Valor, a massive training ground where Celeran warriors honed their combat skills. Energy weapons, staffs, and blades lined the walls. A shimmering energy shield surrounded the battle area, ensuring no one outside got hurt. The Emperor's voice echoed across the arena. "The second trial is combat. Princess Velith has defeated every suitor who dared to challenge her. If the human survives 3 minutes, he wins." David raised an eyebrow. "So I don't even have to beat her. Just last 3 minutes." The nobles laughed, mocking his confidence. Velith grabbed a Celeran war staff, a long metallic weapon that crackled with blue energy. She spun it in her hands with perfect precision. "You won't last 1 minute, human." David picked up a simple combat baton, much shorter than her weapon. He tested its weight, then shrugged. "Let's find out." The battle begins. A loud gong echoed, signaling the start of the duel. Velith moved fast, too fast for most eyes to follow. Her staff whipped through the air, aiming for David's ribs. He barely dodged, feeling the energy crackle inches from his skin. He didn't have her speed, but he had something better: experience. Velith pressed the attack, her strikes precise and relentless. David blocked some, dodged others, but he knew one thing: he couldn't fight her head-on. She was stronger. She was faster, but she was also predictable. The human fights back. At the 1-minute mark, David started to counterattack. Instead of trying to overpower Velith, he redirected her energy. When she struck high, he ducked. When she swung low, he jumped. He used her own speed against her. Velith growled in frustration. No opponent had ever lasted this long against her. At 2 minutes, David saw an opening. As Velith lunged forward, he sidestepped and tapped the back of her leg with his baton. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make her stumble. The crowd gasped. Velith's eyes widened in shock. Had he just toyed with her? David grinned. "You okay, princess?" Her pride burned. She charged at him, swinging her staff in a final powerful arc. The gong sounded. 3 minutes had passed. David had won. Velith stood there, breathless, stunned. No one had ever stood against her like this. For the first time in her life, she felt something she never had before: respect. Velith stood frozen, gripping her war staff tightly. The arena was silent, the nobles staring in disbelief. A human had survived against her. Worse, he had toyed with her, made her stumble in front of everyone. David wiped sweat from his brow, his breath steady. Well, that was fun. he said, smirking. Valeth's jaw clenched. How could this human be so calm? She had fought trained warriors stronger than him, yet he had lasted 3 minutes without fear. The Emperor chuckled from his throne. Impressive, human. You have passed the second trial. The nobles murmured among themselves. No one had ever reached the third trial before. Valeth narrowed her eyes. Don't celebrate yet, human. The next trial is the hardest. David raised an eyebrow. Yeah, what's next? A dance-off. She ignored his sarcasm and turned toward the Emperor. I will take him to the cursed Westlands. If he survives 3 days, he wins. Gasps filled the court. The cursed wastelands. One noble whispered, no outsider has ever returned from there. Another murmured. David looked between them, then at Valeth. That doesn't sound very welcoming. She smirked. It's not supposed to be. The wastelands. Hours later, David and Valeth stood at the edge of a barren desert, stretching endlessly under a twin-sun sky. The air was scorching, and the ground cracked beneath their feet. In the distance, massive creatures with armored hides moved through the sand. David sighed. And here I thought this place would have a gift shop. Valeth ignored him and tossed him a small survival pack. No weapons, no tech, just instincts. David examined the pack, some water, a knife, and a small energy ration. That's it. She crossed her arms. Survive or die. That is the challenge. He grinned. Great, just like my military training. Valeth's eyes narrowed. Let's see if your training keeps you alive. With that, they stepped into the wastelands. The struggle begins. The first day was brutal. The heat was merciless, and David felt his skin burning under the twin suns. Valeth walked ahead, moving gracefully, her body adapted to the harsh conditions. David wasn't so lucky. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his muscles ached, and dehydration hit fast. But he refused to show weakness. He had survived worse. As the sun began to set, they'd reached a rocky shelter. Valeth, still composed, glanced at him. Tired, human. David smirked, though exhaustion was clear in his eyes. Just getting started. Valeth stared at him, something shifting inside her. This human was different. Any other suitor would be begging for mercy by now. But David, he was still standing. The first night in the wastelands was cold and merciless. David sat near the small fire he had built, rubbing his hands for warmth. Just hours ago, the heat had been unbearable, but now, the temperature had dropped dangerously low. Survival was a game of extremes here. Valeth sat across from him, her glowing violet eyes watching him closely. Unlike David, she didn't seem bothered by the cold. Her body, adapted to this world, handled the harsh climate much better than his. You're struggling, human, she said. David smirked, his breath visible in the freezing air. Yeah, well, I'm still here. Valeth expected him to complain, to show fear, but he didn't. He was stubborn. She hated to admit it, but she was starting to respect that. Sleep if you can, she said. Tomorrow will be worse. David leaned back against the rock wall. You're just full of good news, aren't you? Valeth didn't respond. Instead, she simply closed her eyes, her body still, like a statue. David exhaled, staring at the twin moons above. This was going to be a long night. The second day, a deadly hunt. By midday, the heat was back, merciless and unrelenting. David's throat was dry, and his energy fading. He needed food. Valeth led him through a canyon, her movements graceful. She barely left footprints, while David's boots crunched loudly against the sand. She was hunting, her keen eyes scanning for prey. Suddenly, she stopped. Stay quiet. David followed her gaze. Ahead, a 6-legged reptilian beast was drinking from a hidden water source. Valeth moved like a shadow, pulling out a small energy knife. She was about to attack. Crikey. David's foot snapped a dry twig. The beast roared, its golden eyes locking onto them. Then, with terrifying speed, it charged. Valeth cursed and leaped aside. David barely had time to react before the beast was upon him. Instinct took over. He dove to the side, rolled, and grabbed his survival knife. As the creature lunged again, he sidestepped and slashed at its side. The blade barely cut through its thick hide, but it was enough to make it hesitate. Valeth moved in fast, her knife striking with precision. Within seconds, the beast collapsed, defeated. She turned to David, her expression unreadable. That was reckless. David, catching his breath, grinned. Yeah, but we got dinner. Valeth stared at him for a moment, then did something unexpected. She laughed. It was soft, almost musical, and it surprised even her. She had never laughed during a trial before. David blinked. Was that a laugh? Valeth quickly composed herself. No. But David saw the slight smirk on her lips. For the first time, Valeth wasn't just testing the human. She was enjoying his company. The sun had set, casting an orange glow over the wastelands. The air was getting colder, but this time, David was prepared. He sat near the fire, roasting a piece of the creature they had hunted earlier. The smell of cooked meat filled the air. Valeth sat nearby, her violet eyes reflecting the fire's glow. She had been silent for a while, watching David with curiosity. "You are different from the others," she finally said. David took a bite of the meat and chewed. "Yeah. How so?" She studied him for a moment. "Most who attempt this trial boast about their strength, their power. They try to impress me. You don't." David smirked. "Maybe because I don't care about impressing you." Valeth narrowed her eyes, but there was no anger this time. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity. She reached for her own portion of meat, hesitated, then took a small bite. Her kind rarely ate cooked food, but it wasn't bad. They ate in silence for a while. Then, suddenly, Valeth tensed. David noticed it immediately. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed a hand against her side, her expression tightening. David's eyes narrowed. Then he saw it. A deep wound just below her ribs, hidden beneath her armor. Blood. "How long have you been bleeding?" he asked, his voice serious. She didn't answer. David moved closer, but she tried to push him away. "I don't need help." He caught her wrist before she could stop him. "Yeah, well, you're getting it anyway." Valeth stared at him, her pride clashing with common sense. No one had ever dared to touch her like this, yet David wasn't afraid. Finally, she sighed. It happened during the fight with the beast. David cursed under his breath. "And you didn't say anything." "I didn't need to." David shook his head. "You're unbelievable." He pulled out a medical patch from his survival pack. "This is going to sting." She didn't flinch as he gently pressed the patch against her wound, sealing it. His fingers brushed against her skin for a moment, warm against cool. Valeth's breath hitched, but she quickly looked away. "You're too stubborn," David muttered. She glanced at him. "So are you." Their eyes met. For the first time, there was no challenge, no arrogance, just a strange, unexpected understanding. For a moment, Valeth forgot why she had even wanted him to fail. For a moment, she almost didn't want him to. The third day in the wastelands had been even harsher than the first two. Sweat and dust clung to David's skin, his energy drained. The twin suns overhead made the air unbearable, and every step felt like walking through fire. Valeth, despite the physical toll, seemed almost unaffected. She moved with the ease of someone born for this harsh world. But David noticed the subtle changes. She was slowing down. The proud princess, who had never shown weakness before, was feeling the strain. He glanced at her. "You okay?" She didn't answer, her eyes focused on the path ahead. David wasn't fooled. He could see the tightness in her posture, the way her steps were becoming less sure. He had helped her with the wound the day before, but something wasn't right. Finally, Valeth stopped. "We need to rest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David didn't say anything as he took a seat by a rocky outcrop, his muscles sore and stiff. He knew this was far from over. The challenge wasn't just about surviving. It was about pushing through the limits of strength, mind, and willpower. Valeth sat across from him, her breathing shallow. The days in the wastelands had taken their toll, and the weight of her pride had become heavier than ever. She had underestimated him, and now she could feel the consequences. David watched her for a moment, then spoke. "You're not invincible, you know." She shot him a sharp look. "I never said I was." "Yeah, you just acted like it." She frowned, irritated, but there was a hint of something softer in her expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You talk too much, human." David smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at him. "I'm starting to think you don't mind it." Valeth turned away, fighting a reluctant smile. They sat in silence for a while, the wasteland stretching out before them. The heat was still unbearable, and the ground cracked under their feet. But despite the struggle, David felt something else rising in him: determination. This was more than just a trial now. It was a test of everything he was, and he wasn't about to fail. When they resumed their journey, Valeth was moving more slowly, and David stayed close, offering his help when she stumbled. She didn't ask for it, but she didn't push him away either. He knew she was too proud to admit it, but the reality was sinking in. She wasn't going to make it through this without help. The final stretch of the wasteland lay before them, the dangerous cliffs rising in the distance. As they approached the edge, the temperature dropped, the cold biting at their skin. David glanced at her, noticing the subtle change in her demeanor. She was struggling to keep up, her pride and stubbornness holding her back. But even the princess couldn't deny it anymore. She was exhausted. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than before. "You're not going to make it if you don't let me help." Valeth's gaze flicked to him, and for a long moment she said nothing. But then her lips parted. The words came out almost unintentionally. "Please, help me." David blinked, surprised. It was the first time she had ever asked for anything. The proud princess, who had rejected every suitor and every offer of help, had finally surrendered. Without a word, he stepped forward and offered his hand. Valeth took it, her fingers trembling just slightly as she allowed herself to be helped. It was a small gesture, but for the first time, it meant everything. As the fourth day began, the end of the wastelands finally came into view, a distant city on the horizon, bathed in the glow of the twin suns. The long journey through the harsh desert was almost over, but the toll it had taken on both David and Valeth was visible. David's clothes were torn and dirty, his face covered in dust. His body ached with every step, but his mind was still sharp. Valeth, on the other hand, had changed. Her once proud posture had slumped slightly, her steps no longer as graceful as they had been when she first set out. She was pushing through, but it was clear to David that this final leg of the journey was more than just a physical test. This was about willpower, and both of them were close to their limits. The final trial was not just about survival anymore. It was about endurance of the spirit, the strength to keep going when all seemed lost. The walled city of Suitor. They'd reached the gates of the city just before sundown. The large stone walls of the city were imposing, and the crimson banners of the Xelaran Empire fluttered in the wind above them. David glanced at Valeth. She was silent now, her eyes focused, and her hand gripped her staff tightly. The once cocky princess had finally shown her true vulnerability. "I can't believe we're here," David said quietly. Valeth didn't respond. She simply nodded, her face unreadable. She had made it this far, barely, but the hardest part was still ahead. As they walked through the city gates, the citizens turned to watch them. A crowd had gathered, curious to see if the human would make it this far. They were all eager to see if David could survive the final trial, if he could truly prove himself worthy of their princess. The Emperor, Valeth's father, stood in front of the palace steps, awaiting their arrival. He had been watching from a distance, observing every step of the challenge. "So the human has made it this far," he said, his voice booming across the courtyard. "But will he make it through the last test?" David stepped forward, meeting the Emperor's gaze without hesitation. "I'm not here to prove myself to you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here for her." Valeth's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. The crowd watched in silence as the two men sized each other up. The Emperor looked at his daughter. "You have been tested, Valeth, and this human has passed every trial. But this is the final one. His worth will be determined by your decision." Valeth swallowed, her throat dry. She had been so sure of herself before. No one had ever questioned her royalty or her choices. But now, after everything they had been through together, she was unsure. David, the human, had outlasted her. He had shown her a strength and resilience that no Acceleran had ever dared to show. The crowd waited, eager for the princess's answer. Valeth took a deep breath. The words caught in her throat. She couldn't say it. Instead, she stepped toward David and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have passed every trial," she said softly, her voice quiet but certain. "You have earned my respect and my trust." David's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it was as though the entire world had stopped. The crowd, watching in shock, began to whisper, but Valeth didn't care. "I accept you," she continued, her voice stronger now. "Not as a challenger, but as a partner. You have proven your worth." David's expression softened, and for the first time in the long days of the trial, he allowed himself to smile. The air in the palace courtyard was thick with tension. The crowd that had gathered earlier now stood in stunned silence. Valeth, the powerful princess of the Acceleran Empire, had just done the unthinkable. She had not only accepted the human, David, but had chosen him as a partner, something no one had ever done before. David stood at her side, feeling a mixture of disbelief and relief. He had come to this world as a diplomat, never expecting to be part of a royal challenge, much less win her favor. But here he was, standing before the Emperor and the court, his fate forever tied to the alien princess. Valeth turned to face her father, the Emperor, who had watched the entire ordeal unfold. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something unexpected. He had never imagined his daughter would choose a human over the many powerful suitors who had tried to win her. "You've chosen him?" the Emperor asked, his voice cold but not angry. Valeth nodded, her chin held high. "Yes, he has proven himself in ways none of our warriors ever have." The Emperor studied David, as if trying to figure out what it was about this human that had so thoroughly captivated his daughter. "You've survived the trials, human, but now you must prove yourself in the eyes of the Empire. Are you ready for that challenge?" David met the Emperor's gaze, standing tall. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, but I'm not here for power or glory. I'm here because I believe in her, and I want to build a future together." Valeth's heart skipped a beat. She had expected nothing less from him. The words he spoke were simple, but they carried weight, a promise to stand beside her, no matter the cost. The Emperor remained silent for a moment before nodding. "Then it is settled. If you truly wish to stand by my daughter, you must prove your loyalty to the Empire." David stepped forward, his heart steady. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I belong here." A new path. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. David found himself immersed in the politics and culture of the Acceleran Empire. He trained with warriors, learned their customs, and adapted to their advanced technology. But through it all, his mind was always focused on Valeth. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, proud, strong, and fiercely independent. Yet now, after everything they had been through together, he saw a different side of her, one that was vulnerable, uncertain, and most of all, human. One evening after a long day of meetings, David found Valeth in the palace gardens, gazing up at the twin moons. The city around them hummed with life, but here, in this quiet space, it was just the two of them. David approached her slowly, his footsteps barely making a sound. "You're thinking about the trials, aren't you?" he asked softly. Valeth turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I'm thinking about what comes next. The trials are over, but now we have to figure out how to live with our choices." David stepped closer, gently taking her hand. "We don't have to figure it out all at once. We can take it one step at a time, together." Her gaze softened, and for the first time in days, she smiled. A smile full of warmth and hope. "I never imagined it would end like this," she said quietly. "A human, by my side. But now that you're here, I don't want it any other way." David squeezed her hand gently, his voice full of quiet resolve. "Then let's start that journey, together." As the days passed, the bond between David and Valeth grew stronger. They faced the challenges of ruling a vast empire, but they did so with an understanding and respect for each other that no one else could have. The Exelaran Empire was vast, with its customs and traditions, but David and Valeth built their own path, one shaped by their shared experiences, their strength and their love. And in the end, they proved that true strength didn't come from power or position. It came from partnership, from standing together when the world tried to pull them apart. Together, they would face whatever the future held, knowing they were no longer just two beings from different worlds. They were a team, ready for anything. The weeks after David's decision to stay in the Exelaran Empire were full of changes. David and Valeth had found a balance, one that many thought impossible. The human diplomat and the alien princess, once from worlds that could never understand each other, now worked side by side to shape a new future for their people. David had proven his worth, not just by surviving the trials, but by showing that his strength lay in his understanding, his compassion, and his ability to adapt. He was unlike any Exelaran warrior, but his mind and heart were even more powerful. Valeth, for all her pride and independence, had opened up. The trials had changed her. They had shown her what it meant to truly trust someone, to depend on them without losing herself. She was no longer the princess who rejected all suitors. She was a woman who had chosen to share her life with someone who understood her in ways no one else could. The court, at first shocked by their decision, had slowly begun to accept the change. The nobles had begun to see the wisdom in David's approach, the way he handled situations with calm and clarity. Valeth had always been an exceptional leader, but with David by her side, they became an unstoppable team. A new challenge. One day, as they sat together in the royal chambers, Valeth turned to David, her face serious. "There's a challenge ahead, something we both knew would come eventually." David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of challenge?" Valeth leaned forward. "The empire is strong, but there are factions within it that do not approve of our union. There are those who believe only Xelarans should rule, and that a human, even one who has passed the trials, has no place here." David took a deep breath. He had known this would come. After all, no change was ever easy. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse before. "We've overcome bigger obstacles," he said, his voice steady. "We can handle this together, like we always do." Valeth looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Together. You've been saying that a lot lately." David grinned. "It's because it's true." The path ahead. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly to prove that their partnership wasn't just personal. It was for the good of the empire. They met with the noble families, held councils with the military leaders, and made sure that the people knew that this wasn't just a marriage. It was a union between two worlds, one that would make them stronger than ever. David's influence had become indispensable. His strategies for peacekeeping, his understanding of human diplomacy, and his ability to see both sides of every issue were invaluable. The Exelaran generals, who once saw him as nothing more than a diplomat, began to look to him for advice in matters of defense and tactics. As they worked together, their bond only grew deeper. There were moments, in the quiet of their private chambers or during peaceful walks in the palace gardens, where they would look at each other, and in those moments, words weren't needed. They were in this together, a future of hope. In time, the rest of the Celaran Empire began to see the strength of their union. The factions that had once opposed David's place in their world now began to respect him. They saw that the bond between him and Valeth wasn't one built on weakness or foolishness. It was one built on respect, trust, and mutual strength. Valeth stood beside David, not just as his wife, but as his equal. She had learned the true meaning of partnership, something that had eluded her for so long. As they looked out over the palace gardens one evening, watching the twin suns dip below the horizon, Valeth turned to David. "I never thought this day would come," she said softly. David smiled, squeezing her hand. "Me neither. But now that we're here, there's no place I'd rather be." Together, they looked ahead at the future, knowing that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them side by side. The Celaran Empire, with its ancient customs and powerful traditions, had found something new, a future not just for its people, but for its rulers. A human and a princess who had once been so different now stood as equals, ready to lead their world into a future filled with hope and promise.